Chapter 22 of Book 1 of Les Misérables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood, Book 1, The War Between Four Walls, Chapter 22, Foot to Foot. When there were no longer any of the leaders left alive except Enjolras and Marius at the two extremities of the barricade, the centre, which had so long sustained Courfeyrac, Joly, Bossuet, Feuillet, and Combeferre, gave way. The cannon, though it had not effected a practical breach, had made a rather large hollow in the middle of the redoubt. There, the summit of the wall had disappeared before the balls, and had crumbled away, and the rubbish which had fallen, now inside, now outside, had, as it accumulated, formed two piles in the nature of slopes on the two sides of the barrier, one on the inside, the other on the outside. The exterior slope presented an inclined plane to the attack. A final assault was there attempted, and this assault succeeded. The mass, bristling with bayonets and hurled forward at a run, came up with irresistible force, and the serried front of battle of the attacking column made its appearance through the smoke on the crest of the battlements. This time it was decisive. The group of insurgents who were defending the centre retreated in confusion. Then the gloomy love of life awoke once more in some of them. Many, finding themselves under the muzzle of this forest of guns, did not wish to die. This is the moment when the instinct of self-preservation emits howls, when the beast reappears in men. They were hemmed in by the lofty six-story house which formed the background of their redoubt. This house might prove to be their salvation. The building was barricaded and walled, as it were, from top to bottom. Before the troops of the line had reached the interior of the redoubt, there was time for a door to open and shut. The space of the flash of a lightning was sufficient for that, and the door of that house, suddenly opened a crack and closed again instantly, was life for these despairing men. Behind this house there were streets, possible flight space. They set to knocking at that door with the butts of their gun, and with kicks, shouting, calling, entreating, wringing their hands. No one opened. From the little window on the third floor, the head of a dead man gazed down upon them. But Enjolras and Marius and the 7 or 8 rallied about them, sprang forward and protected them. Enjolras had shouted to the soldiers, "Don't advance!" and as an officer had not obeyed, Enjolras had killed the officer. He was now in the little inner court of the redoubt, with his back planted against the Corinth building, a sword in one hand, a rifle in the other, holding open the door of the wine shop which he barred against assailants. He shouted to the desperate men, "There is but one open door, this one," and shielding him with his body, and facing an entire battalion alone, he made them pass in behind him. All precipitated themselves thither. Enjolras, executing with his rifle, which he now used like a cane, what single-stick players called a covered rose round his head, levelled the bayonets around and in front of him, and was the last to enter. And then ensued a horrible moment, when the soldiers tried to make their way in, and the insurgents strove to bar them out. The door was slammed with such violence that, as it fell back into his frame, it showed the 5 fingers of a soldier who had been clinging to it, cut off and glued to the post. Marius remained outside. A shot had just broken his collarbone. He felt that he was fainting and falling. At that moment, with eyes already shut, he felt the shock of a vigorous hand seizing him, and the swoon in which his senses vanished, hardly allowing him time for the thought, mingled with the last memory of Cosette, "I am taken prisoner. I shall be shot." Enjolras, not seeing Marius among those who had taken refuge in the wine shop, had the same idea. But they had reached a moment when each man has not the time to meditate on his own death. Enjolras fixed the bar across the door and bolted it, and double-locked it with key and chain, while those outside were battering furiously at it, the soldiers with the butts of their muskets, the sappers with their axes. The assailants were grouped about that door. The siege of the wine shop was now beginning. The soldiers, we will observe, were full of wrath. The death of the artillery sergeant had enraged them, and then a still more melancholy circumstance. During the few hours which had preceded the attack, it had been reported among them that the insurgents were mutilating their prisoners, and that there was a headless body of a soldier in the wine shop. This sort of fatal rumor is usually accompaniment of civil wars, and it was a false report of this kind which, later on, produced the catastrophe of Rue Transnonain. When the door was barricaded, Enjolras said to the others, "Let us sell our lives dearly." Then he approached the table on which lay Mabeuf and Gavroche. Beneath the black cloth, two straight and rigid forms were visible, one large and the other small, and the two faces were vaguely outlined beneath the cold folds of the shroud. A hand projected from beneath the winding sheet and hung near the floor. It was that of the old man. Enjolras bent down and kissed that venerable hand, just as he had kissed his brow on the preceding evening. These were the only two kisses which he had bestowed in the course of his life. Let us abridge the tale. The barricade had fought like the gate of Thebes. The wine shop fought like a house of Saragossa. These resistances are dogged. No quarter, no flag of truce possible. Men are willing to die, provided their opponent will kill them. When Suchet says, "Capitulate," Palafox replies, "After the war with cannon, the war with knives." Nothing was lacking in the capture by assault of the Hachoulette wine shop. Neither paving stones raining from the windows and the roof on the besiegers, and exasperating the soldiers by crushing them horribly, nor shots fired from the attic windows and the cellar, nor the fury of the attack, nor finally, when the door yielded, the frenzied madness of extermination. The assailants, rushing into the wine shop, their feet entangled in the panels of the door which had been beaten in and flung on the ground, found not a single combatant there. The spiral staircase, hewn asunder with the axe, lay in the middle of the tap-room. A few wounded men were just breathing their last. Everyone who was not killed on the first floor, and from there, through the hole in the ceiling, which had formed the entrance of the stairs, a terrific fire burst forth. This was the last of their cartridges. When they were exhausted, when these formidable men on the point of death had no longer either powder or ball, each grasped in his hands two of the bottles which Enjolras had reserved, and of which we had spoken, and held the scaling party in check with these frightfully fragile clubs. They were the bottle of aquafortis. We relate these gloomy incidents of carnage as they occurred. The besieged man, alas, converts everything into a weapon. Greek fire did not disgrace Archimedes. Boiling pitch did not disgrace Bayard. All war is a thing of terror, and there is no choice in it. The musketry of the besiegers, though confined and embarrassed by being directed from below upwards, was deadly. The rim of the hole in the ceiling was speedily surrounded by heads of the slain, whence dripping long, red and smoking streams. The uproar was indescribable. A close and burning smoke almost produced night over this combat. Words are lacking to express horror when it has reached this pitch. There were no longer men in this conflict, which was now infernal. They are no longer giants mashed with the colossi. It resembled Milton and Dante rather than Homer. Demons attacked, spectres resisted. It was heroism become monstrous. End of Book 1, Chapter 22.
Chapters 23 through 24 of Book 1 of Les Misérables, Volume 5, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 5, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 1, The War Between Four Walls. Chapter 23. Orestes fasting, and Pylades drunk. At length, by dint of mounting on each other's backs, aiding themselves with the skeleton of the staircase, climbing up the walls, clinging to the ceiling, slashing away at the very brink of the trap-door, the last one who offered resistance, a score of assailants, soldiers, National Guardsmen, municipal guardsmen, in utter confusion, the majority disfigured by wounds in the face during that redoubtable ascent, blinded by blood, furious, rendered savage, made an irruption into the apartment on the first floor. There they found only one man still on his feet, Enjolras. Without cartridges, without sword, he had nothing in his hand now but the barrel of his gun, whose stock he had broken over the head of those who were entering. He had placed the billiard table between his assailants and himself. He had retreated into the corner of the room, and there, with haughty eye and head borne high, with the stump of a weapon in his hand, he was still so alarming as to speedily create an empty space around him. A cry arose. "He is the leader! It was he who slew the artilleryman! It is well that he has placed himself there. Let him remain there. Let us shoot him down on the spot." "Shoot me," said Enjolras. And flinging away his bit of gun-barrel and folding his arms, he offered his breast. The audacity of a fine death always affects men. As soon as Enjolras folded his arms and accepted his end, the din of strife ceased in the room, and this chaos suddenly stilled into a sort of sepulchral solemnity. The menacing majesty of Enjolras, disarmed and motionless, appeared to oppress this tumult, and this young man, haughty, bloody, and charming, who alone had not a wound, who was as indifferent as an invulnerable being, seemed, by the authority of his tranquil glance, to constrain this sinister rabble to kill him respectfully. His beauty at that moment, augmented by his pride, was resplendent, and he was fresh and rosy after the fearful 24 hours which had just elapsed, as though he could no more be fatigued than wounded. It was of him, possibly, that a witness spoke afterwards before the council of war. There was an insurgent whom I heard called Apollo. A National Guardsman who had taken aim at Enjolras lowered his gun, saying, "It seems to me that I am about to shoot a flower." 12 men formed into a squad in the corner opposite Enjolras, and silently made ready their guns. Then a sergeant shouted, "Take aim!" An officer intervened. "Wait." And addressing Enjolras, "Do you wish to have your eyes bandaged?" "No." "Was it you who killed the artillery sergeant?" "Yes." Grantaire had waked up a few moments before. Grantaire, it will be remembered, had been asleep ever since the preceding evening in the upper room of the wine-shop, seated on a chair and leaning on the table. He realized, in its fullest sense, the old metaphor of dead drunk. The hideous potion of absinthe, porter, and alcohol had thrown him into a lethargy. His table being small and not suitable for the barricade, he had been left in possession of it. He was still in the same posture, with his breast bent over the table, his head lying flat on his arms, surrounded by glasses, beer jugs, and bottles. His was the overwhelming slumber of the torpid bear and the satiated leech. Nothing had had any effect upon it, neither the fusillade, nor the cannonballs, nor the grape-shot which had made its way through the window into the room where he was, nor the tremendous uproar of the assault. He merely replied to the cannonade now and then by a snore. He seemed to be waiting there for a bullet which should spare him the trouble of waking. Many corpses were strewn around him, and, at the first glance, there was nothing to distinguish him from those profound sleepers of death. Noise does not rouse a drunken man. Silence awakens him. The fall of everything around him only augmented Grantaire's prostration. The crumbling of all things was his lullaby. The sort of halt which the tumult underwent in the presence of Enjolras was a shock to this heavy slumber. It had the effect of a carriage going at full speed, which suddenly comes to a dead stop. The persons dozing within it wake up. Grantaire rose to his feet with a start, stretched out his arms, rubbed his eyes, stared, yawned, and understood. A fit of drunkenness, reaching its end, resembles a curtain which is torn away. One beholds at a single glance, and as a whole, all that it has concealed. All suddenly presents itself to the memory, and the drunkard who has known nothing of what has been taking place during the last 24 hours has no sooner opened his eyes than he is perfectly informed. Ideas recur to him with abrupt lucidity. The obliteration of intoxication, a sort of steam which has obscured the brain, is dissipated, and makes way for the clear and sharply outlined importunity of realities. Relegated as he was to one corner and sheltered behind the billiard table, the soldiers whose eyes were fixed on Enjolras had not even noticed Grantaire, and the sergeant was preparing to repeat his order, "Take aim," when all at once they heard a strong voice shout beside them, "Long live the Republic! I'm one of them." Grantaire had risen. The immense gleam of the whole combat, which he had missed, and in which he had had no part, appeared in the brilliant glance of this transfigured, drunken man. He repeated, "Long live the Republic!" crossed the room with a firm stride, and placed himself in front of the guns beside Enjolras. "Finish both of us at one blow," said he. And turning gently to Enjolras, he said to him, "Do you permit it?" Enjolras pressed his hand with a smile. The smile was not ended when the report resounded. Enjolras, pierced by 8 bullets, remained leaning against the wall as though the balls had nailed him there. Only his head was bowed. Grantaire fell at his feet, as though struck by a thunderbolt. A few moments later, the soldiers dislodged the last remaining insurgents, who had taken refuge at the top of the house. They fired into the attic through a wooden lattice. They fought under the very roof. They flung bodies, some of them still alive, out through the windows. 2 light infantrymen, who tried to lift the shattered omnibus, were slain by 2 shots fired from the attic. A man in a blouse was flung down from it with a bayonet wound in the abdomen, and breathed his last on the ground. A soldier and an insurgent slipped together on the sloping slates of the roof, and, as they would not release each other, they fell, clasped in a ferocious embrace. A similar conflict went on in the cellar. Shouts, shots, a fierce trampling. Then silence. The barricade was captured. The soldiers began to search the house round about and to pursue the fugitives. Chapter 24. Prisoner. Marius was, in fact, a prisoner. The hand which had seized him from behind, and whose grasp he had felt at the moment of his fall and his loss of consciousness, was that of Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean had taken no other part in the combat than to expose himself in it. Had it not been for him, no one in that supreme phase of agony would have thought of the wounded. Thanks to him, everywhere present in the carnage, like a providence, those who fell were picked up, transported to the tap room, and cared for. In the intervals, he reappeared on the barricade. But nothing which could resemble a blow, an attack, or even personal defense proceeded from his hands. He held his peace and lent succor. Moreover, he had received only a few scratches. The bullets would have none of him. If suicide formed part of what he had meditated on coming to the sepulchre, to that spot, he had not succeeded. But we doubt whether he had thought of suicide, an irreligious act. Jean Valjean, in the thick cloud of the combat, did not appear to see Marius. The truth is that he never took his eyes from the latter. When a shot laid Marius low, Jean Valjean leapt forward with the agility of a tiger, fell upon him as on his prey, and bore him off. The whirlwind of the attack was, at that moment, so violently concentrated upon Enjolras and upon the door of the wine-shop that no one saw Jean Valjean, sustaining the fainting Marius in his arms, traverse the unpaved field of the barricade and disappear behind the angle of the Corinth building. The reader will recall this angle, which formed a sort of cape on the street. It afforded shelter from the bullets, the grape-shot, and all eyes, and a few square feet of space. There is sometimes a chamber which does not burn in the midst of a conflagration, and in the midst of raging seas, beyond a promontory, or at the extremity of a blind alley of shoals, a tranquil nook. It was in this sort of fold, in the interior trapezium of the barricade, that Éponine had breathed her last. There, Jean Valjean halted, let Marius slide to the ground, placed his back against the wall, and cast his eyes about him. The situation was alarming. For an instant, for 2 or 3 perhaps, this bit of wall was a shelter, but how was he to escape from this massacre? He recalled the anguish which he had suffered in the Rue Policieux 8 years before, and in what manner he had contrived to make his escape. It was difficult then, today it was impossible. He had before him that deaf and implacable house, 6 stories in height, which appeared to be inhabited only by a dead man leaning out of his window. He had on his right the rather low barricade, which shut off the Rue de la Petite Truanderie. To pass this obstacle seemed easy, but beyond the crest of the barrier a line of bayonets was visible. The troops of the line were posted on the watch behind the barricade. It was evident that to pass the barricade was to go in quest of the fire of the platoon, and that any head which should run the risk of lifting itself above the top of that wall of stones would serve as a target for 60 shots. On his left he had the field of battle. Death lurked round the corner of that wall. What was to be done? Only a bird could have extricated itself from this predicament. And it was necessary to decide on the instant, to devise some expedient, to come to some decision. Fighting was going on a few paces away. Fortunately, all were raging around a single point, the door of the wine shop. But if it should occur to one soldier, to one single soldier, to turn the corner of the house or to attack him on the flank, all was over. Jean Valjean gazed at the house facing him. He gazed at the barricade at one side of him. Then he looked at the ground, with the violence of the last extremity, bewildered, and as though he would have liked to pierce a hole there with his eyes. By dint of staring, something vaguely striking in such an agony began to assume form and outline at his feet, as though it had been a power of glance which made the thing desired unfold. A few paces distant he perceived, at the base of the small barrier so pitilessly guarded and watched on the exterior, beneath a disordered mass of paving stones which partly concealed it, an iron grating, placed flat and on a level with the soil. This grating, made of stout, transverse bars, was about 2 feet square. The frame of paving stones which supported it had been torn up, and it was, as it were, unfastened. Through the bars, a view could be had of a dark aperture, something like the flue of a chimney or the pipe of a cistern. Jean Valjean darted forward. His old art of escape rose to his brain like an illumination. To thrust aside the stones, to raise the grating, to lift Marius, who was as inert as a dead body, upon his shoulders, to descend with this burden on his loins, and with the aid of his elbows and knees into that sort of well, fortunately not very deep, to let the heavy trap, upon which the loosened stones rolled down afresh, fall into its place behind him, to gain his footing on a flagged surface 3 meters below the surface. All this was executed like that which one does in dreams, with the strength of a giant and the rapidity of an eagle. This took only a few minutes. Jean Valjean found himself with Marius, who was still unconscious, in a sort of long, subterranean corridor. There reigned profound peace, absolute silence, night. The impression which he had formerly experienced when falling from the wall into the convent recurred to him. Only what he was carrying today was not Cosette, it was Marius. He could barely hear the formidable tumult in the wine shop, taken by assault, like a vague murmur overhead. End of Book 1, Chapters 23 through 24.
Chapters 1 and 2 of Book 2 of Les Misérables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 2, The Intestine of the Leviathan. Chapter 1, The Land Impoverished by the Sea. Paris casts 25 millions yearly into the water, and this without metaphor. How and in what manner? Day and night. With what object? With no object. With what intention? With no intention. Why? For no reason. By means of what organ? By means of its intestine. What is its intestine? The sewer. 25 millions is the most moderate approximative figure which the valuations of special science have set upon it. Science, after having long groped about, now knows that the most fecundating and the most efficacious of fertilizers is human manure. The Chinese, let us confess it to our shame, knew it before us. Not a Chinese peasant, it is Eckbert who says this, goes to town without bringing back with him, at the two extremities of his bamboo pole, 2 full buckets of what we designate as filth. Thanks to human dung, the earth in China is still as young as in the days of Abraham. Chinese wheat yields 100-fold of the seed. There is no guano comparable in fertility with the detritus of a capital. A great city is the most mighty of dung makers. Certain success would attend the experiment of employing the city to manure the plain. If our gold is manure, our manure, on the other hand, is gold. What is done with this golden manure? It is swept into the abyss. Fleets of vessels are dispatched at great expense to collect the dung of petrels and penguins at the South Pole, and the incalculable element of opulence which we have on hand we send to the sea. All the human and animal manure which the world wastes, restored to the land, instead of being cast into the water, would suffice to nourish the world. Those heaps of filth at the gateposts, those tumbrils of mud which jolt through the street by night, those terrible casks of the street department, those fetid drippings of subterranean mire which the pavements hide from you, do you know what they are? They are the meadow in flower, the green grass, wild thyme, thyme and sage. They are game, they are cattle, they are the satisfied bellows of great oxen in the evening. They are perfumed hay, they are golden wheat, they are the bread on your table, they are the warm blood in your veins. They are health, they are joy, they are life. This is the will of that mysterious creation which is transformation on earth and transfiguration in heaven. Restore this to the great crucible, your abundance will flow forth from it. The nutrition of the plains furnishes the nourishment of men. You have it in your power to lose this wealth and to consider me ridiculous to boot. This will form the masterpiece of your ignorance. Statisticians have calculated that France alone makes a deposit of 500 milliards every year in the Atlantic through the mouths of her rivers. Note this, with 500 millions, we could pay 1/4 of the expenses of our budget. The cleverness of man is such that he prefers to get rid of these 500 millions in the gutter. It is the very substance of the people that is carried off. Here, drop by drop, there, wave after wave, the wretched outpour of our sewers into the rivers, and the gigantic collection of our rivers into the ocean. Every hiccup of our sewers costs us 1,000 francs. From this spring 2 results, the land impoverished and the water tainted, hunger arising from the furrow, and disease from the stream. It is notorious, for example, that at the present hour the Thames is poisoning London. So far as Paris is concerned, it has become indispensable of late to transport the mouths of the sewers downstream below the last bridge. A double tubular apparatus provided with valves and sluices, sucking up and driving back a system of elementary drainage, simple as the lungs of a man, and which is already in full working order in many communities in England, would suffice to conduct the pure water of the fields into our cities, and to send back to the fields the rich water of the cities, and this easy exchange, the simplest in the world, would retain among us the 500 millions now thrown away. People are thinking of other things. The process actually in use does evil with the intention of doing good. The intention is good, the result is melancholy. Thinking to purge the city, the population is blanched like plants raised in cellars. A sewer is a mistake. When drainage everywhere, with its double function, restoring what it takes, shall have replaced the sewer, which is a simple impoverishing washing, then, this being combined with the data of a now social economy, the product of the earth will be increased tenfold, and the problem of misery will be singularly lightened. Add the suppression of parasitism, and it will be solved. In the meanwhile, the public wealth flows away to the river, and leakage takes place. Leakage is the word. Europe is being ruined in this manner by exhaustion. As for France, we have just cited its figures. Now, Paris contains 1/25 of the total population of France, and Parisian guano being the richest of all, we understate the truth when we value the loss on the part of Paris at 25 millions in the $500,000,000 which France annually rejects. Those 25 millions employed in assistance and enjoyment would double the splendor of Paris. The city spends them in sewers. So that we may say that Paris's great prodigality, its wonderful festival, its beau gens folly, its orgy, its stream of gold from full hands, its pomp, its luxury, its magnificence, is its sewer system. It is in this manner that, in the blindness of a poor political economy, we drown and allow to float downstream and to be lost in the gulfs the well-being of all. There should be nets at St. Cloud for the public fortune. Economically considered, the matter can be summed up thus. Paris is a spendthrift. Paris, that model city, that patron of well-arranged capitals, of which every nation strives to possess a copy, that metropolis of the ideal, that august country of the initiative, of impulse, and of effort, that center and that dwelling of minds, that nation-city, that hive of the future, that marvelous combination of Babylon and Corinth, would make a peasant of the Phocian shrug his shoulders from the point of view which we have just indicated. Imitate Paris, and you will ruin yourselves. Moreover, and particularly in this immemorial and senseless waste, Paris is itself an imitator. These surprising exhibitions of stupidity are not novel. This is no young folly. The ancients did like the moderns. The sewers of Rome, says Liebig, have absorbed all the well-being of the Roman peasant. When the Campagna of Rome was ruined by the Roman sewer, Rome exhausted Italy, and when she had put Italy in her sewer, she poured in Sicily, then Sardinia, then Africa. The sewer of Rome has engulfed the world. This cesspool offered its engulfment to the city and the universe. Urbi et orbi, eternal city, unfathomable sewer. Rome sets the example for these things as well as for others. Paris follows this example with all the stupidity peculiar to intelligent towns. For the requirements of the operation upon the subject of which we have just explained our views, Paris has beneath it another Paris, a Paris of sewers, which has its streets, its crossroads, its squares, its blind alleys, its arteries, and its circulation, which is of mire and minus the human form. For nothing must be flattered, not even a great people. Where there is everything, there is also ignominy by the side of sublimity. And if Paris contains Athens, the city of light, Tyre, the city of might, Sparta, the city of virtue, Nineveh, the city of marvels, it also contains Lutetia, the city of mud. However, the stamp of its power is there also, and the titanic think of Paris realizes, among monuments, that strange ideal realized in humanity by some men like Machiavelli, Bacon, and Mirabeau, grandiose vileness. The subsoil of Paris, if the eye could penetrate its surface, would present the aspect of a colossal madrepore. A sponge has no more partitions and ducts than the mound of earth for a circuit of 6 leagues round about, on which rests the great and ancient city. Not to mention its catacombs, which are a separate cellar, not to mention the inextricable trellis work of gas pipes, without reckoning the vast tubular system for the distribution of fresh water which ends in the pillar fountains. The sewers alone form a tremendous shadowy network under the 2 banks, a labyrinth which has its slope for its guiding thread. There appears, in the humid mist, the rat, which seems the product to which Paris has given birth. Chapter 2. Ancient History of the Sewer. Let the reader imagine Paris lifted off like a cover. The subterranean network of sewers, from a bird's-eye view, will outline on the banks a species of large branch grafted on the river. On the right bank, the belt sewer will form the trunk of this branch. The secondary ducts will form the branches, and those without exit, the twigs. This figure is but a summary one, and half exact. The right angle, which is the customary angle of this species of subterranean ramifications, being very rare in vegetation. A more accurate image of this strange geometrical plan can be formed by supposing that one is viewing some eccentric oriental alphabet as intricate as a thicket, against a background of shadows, and the misshapen letters should be welded one to another in apparent confusion, and, as at haphazard, now by their angles, again by their extremities. Sinks and sewers played a great part in the Middle Ages, in the Lower Empire, and in the Orient of old. The masses regarded these beds of decomposition, these monstrous cradles of death, with a fear that was almost religious. The vermin ditch of Benares is no less conducive to giddiness than the lion's ditch of Babylon. Teglath-Phalasar, according to the rabbinical books, swore by the sink of Nineveh. It was from the sewer of Munster that John of Leyden produced his false moon, and it was from the cesspool of Keksheb that Oriental Menalchme, Makanna, the veiled prophet of Khorasan, caused his false sun to emerge. The history of men is reflected in the history of sewers. The Germonii narrated Rome. The sewer of Paris has been an ancient and formidable thing. It has been a sepulchre. It has served as an asylum. Crime, intelligence, social protest, liberty of conscience, thought, theft, all that human laws persecute or have persecuted, is hidden in that hole. The Maillotins in the 14th century, the Tire-Laine of the 15th, the Huguenots in the 16th, Morans illuminated in the 17th, the chauffeurs, brigands, in the 18th. 100 years ago, the nocturnal blow of the dagger emerged thence. The pickpocket in danger slipped thither. The forest had its cave. Paris had its sewer. Vagrancy, that Gallic Picareria, accepted the sewer as the adjunct of the Cour des Miracles, and at evening it returned thither, fierce and sly, through the Maubuée outlet as into a bedchamber. It was quite natural that those who had the blind alley vide-gousset, empty pocket, or the rue coupe-gorge, cut-throat, for the scene of their daily labour, should have for their domicile by night the culvert of the chemin vert, or the catch-basin of Hurepoix. Hence a throng of souvenirs. All sorts of phantoms haunt these long solitary corridors. Everywhere is putrescence and miasma. Here and there are breathing holes, where Villon within converses with Rabelais without. The sewer in ancient Paris is the rendezvous of all exhaustions and of all attempts. Political economy therein spies a detritus. Social philosophy there beholds a residuum. The sewer is the conscience of the city. Everything there converges and confronts everything else. In that livid spot there are shades, but there are no longer any secrets. Each thing bears its true form, or at least its definitive form. The mass of filth has this in its favor, that it is not a liar. Ingenuousness has taken refuge there. The mask of Basel is to be found there, but one beholds its cardboard and its strings, and the inside as well as the outside, and it is accentuated by honest mud. Scapin's false nose is its next-door neighbor. All the uncleannesses of civilization, once past their use, fall into this trench of truth, where the immense social sliding ends. They are there engulfed, but they display themselves there. This mixture is a confession. There no more false appearances, no plastering over is possible. Filth removes its shirt. Absolute denudation puts to the rout all illusions and mirages. There is nothing more except what really exists, presenting the sinister form of that which is coming to an end. There the bottom of a bottle indicates drunkenness. A basket handle tells a tale of domesticity. There the core of an apple which has entertained literary opinions becomes an apple core once more. The effigy on the Big Sioux becomes frankly covered with verdigris. Caiaphas' spittle meets Falstaff's puking. The louis d'or, which comes from the gaming house, jostles the nail whence hangs the rope's end of the suicide. A livid fetus rolls along, enveloped in the spangles which danced at the opera last Shrove Tuesday. A cap which has pronounced judgment on men wallows beside a mass of rottenness which was formerly Margoton's petticoat. It is more than fraternization. It is equivalent to addressing each other as thou. All which was formerly rouged is washed free. The last veil is torn away. A sewer is a cynic. It tells everything. The sincerity of foulness pleases us and rests the soul. When one has passed one's time in enduring upon earth the spectacle of the great airs, which reasons of state, the oath, political sagacity, human justice, professional probity, the austerities of situation, incorruptible robes, all assume, it solaces one to enter a sewer and to behold the mire which befits it. This is instructive at the same time. We have just said that history passes through the sewer. The Saint Barthélemys filter through there, drop by drop, between the paving stones. Great public assassinations, political and religious butcheries, traverse this underground passage of civilization and thrust their corpses there. For the eye of the thinker, all historic murderers are to be found there, in that hideous penumbra, on their knees, with a scrap of their winding sheet for an apron, dismally sponging out their work. Louis XI is there with Tristan, Francois I with Duprat, Charles IX is there with his mother, Richelieu is there with Louis XIII, Louvois is there, Letellier is there, Hébert and Maillard are there, scratching the stones and trying to make the traces of their actions disappear. Beneath these vaults one hears the brooms of spectres. One there breathes the enormous fetidness of social catastrophes. One beholds reddish reflections in the corners. There flows a terrible stream in which bloody hands have been washed. The social observer should enter these shadows. They form a part of his laboratory. Philosophy is the microscope of the thought. Everything desires to flee from it, but nothing escapes it. Tergiversation is useless. What side of oneself does one display in evasions? The shameful side. Philosophy pursues with its glance, probes the evil, and does not permit it to escape into nothingness. in the obliteration of things which disappear, in the watching of things which vanish, it recognizes all. It reconstructs the purple from the rag, and the woman from the scrap of her dress. From the cesspool, it reconstitutes the city. From mud, it reconstructs manners. From the potsherd, it infers the amphora or the jug. By the imprint of a fingernail on a piece of parchment, it recognizes the difference which separates the Jewry of the Judengasse from the Jewry of the ghetto. It rediscovers in what remains that which has been. Good, evil, the true, the blood-stain of the palace, the ink-blot of the cavern, the drop of sweat from the brothel, trials undergone, temptations welcomed, orgies cast forth, the turn which characters have taken as they became abased, the trace of prostitution in souls of which their grossness rendered them capable, and on the vesture of the porters of Rome, the mark of Messalina's elbowing. End of Book 2, Chapters 1 and 2.
Chapter 3, Chapter 4 of Book 2 of Les Misérables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 2, The Intestine of the Leviathan. Chapter 3, Bruneseau. The sewer of Paris in the Middle Ages was legendary. In the 16th century, Henry II attempted a bore, which failed. Not 100 years ago, the cesspool, Mercier attests the fact, was abandoned to itself and fared as best it might. Such was this Paris, delivered over to quarrels, to indecision, and to gropings. It was tolerably stupid for a long time. Later on, 89 showed how understanding comes to cities. But in the good old times, the capital had not much head. It did not know how to manage its own affairs, either morally or materially, and could not sweep out filth any better than it could abuses. Everything presented an obstacle. Everything raised a question. The sewer, for example, was refractory to every itinerary. One could no more find one's bearings in the sewer than one could understand one's position in the city. Above the unintelligible, below the inextricable. Beneath the confusion of tongues there reigned the confusion of caverns. Daedalus backed up by Babel. Sometimes the Paris sewer took a notion to overflow, as though this misunderstood Nile was suddenly seized with a fit of rage. There occurred, infamous to relate, inundations of the sewer. At times, that stomach of civilization digested badly. The cesspool flowed back into the throat of the city, and Paris got an aftertaste of her own filth. These resemblances of the sewer to remorse had their good points. They were warnings, very badly accepted, however. The city waxed indignant at the audacity of its mire, and did not admit that the filth should return. Drive it out better. The inundation of 1802 is one of the actual memories of Parisians of the age of 80. The mud spread in cross form over the Place des Victoires, where stands the statue of Louis XIV. It entered the Rue Saint-Honore by the 2 mouths to the sewer in the Champs-Élysées, the Rue Saint-Florentin through the Saint-Florentin sewer, the Rue Pierre-à-Poisson through the sewer de la Saunière, the Rue Popincourt through the sewer of the Chemin Vert, the Rue de la Roquette through the sewer de la Lappe. It covered the drain of the Rue des Champs-Élysées to the height of 35 centimeters, and to the south, through the vent of the Seine, performed its functions in inverse sense. It penetrated the Rue Mazarine, the Rue de la Chaux, and the Rue des Marais, where it stopped at a distance of 109 meters, a few paces distance from the house in which Racine had lived, respecting, in the 17th century, the poet more than the king. It attained its maximum depth in the Rue Saint-Pierre, where it rose to the height of 3 feet above the flagstones of the water-spout, and its maximum length in the Rue Saint-Sabin, where it spread out over a stretch of 238 meters in length. At the beginning of this century, the sewer of Paris was still a mysterious place. Mud can never enjoy a good fame, but in this case its evil renown reached the verge of the terrible. Paris knew in a confused way that she had under her a terrible cavern. People talked of it as of that monstrous bed of Thebes in which swarmed centipedes 15 long feet in length, and which might have served Behemoth for a bathtub. The great boots of the sewermen never ventured further than certain well-known points. We were then very near the epoch when the scavengers' carts, from the summit of which Sainte-Foy fraternized with Marquis de Créqui, discharged their loads directly into the sewer. As for cleaning out, that function was entrusted to the pouring rains, which encumbered rather than swept away. Rome left some poetry to her sewer and called it the Gémone. Paris insulted hers and entitled it the Polypus Hole. Science and superstition were in accord, in horror. The Polypus Hole was no less repugnant to hygiene than to legend. The goblin was developed under the fetid covering of the Mouffetard sewer. The corpses of the Marmousets had been cast into the Sewer de la Barillerie. Fagon attributed the redoubtable malignant fever of 1685 to the great hiatus of the Sewer of the Marais, which remained yawning until 1833 in the Rue Saint-Louis, almost opposite the sign of the Gallant Messenger. The mouth of the sewer of the Rue de la Mortellerie was celebrated for the pestilences which had their source there. With its grating of iron, with points simulating a row of teeth, it was like a dragon's maw in that fatal street, breathing forth hell upon men. The popular imagination seasoned the sombre Parisian sink with some indescribably hideous intermixture of the infinite. The sewer had no bottom. The sewer was the lower world. The idea of exploring these leprous regions did not even occur to the police. To try that unknown thing, to cast the plummet into that shadow, to set out on a voyage of discovery in that abyss? Who would have dared? It was alarming. Nevertheless, someone did present himself. The cesspool had its Christopher Columbus. One day in 1805, during one of the rare apparitions which the emperor made in Paris, the minister of the interior, some de Cré or Crété or other, came to the master's intimate levee. In the carousel there was the audible clanking of swords of all those extraordinary soldiers of the great Republic and of the great Empire. Then Napoleon's door was blocked with heroes. Men from the Rhine, from the Escaut, from the Adige, and from the Nile. Companions of Joubert, of Desailles, of Marceau, of Hoc, of Kleber, the Aristiers of Fleurus, the Grenadiers of Mayence, the pontoon builders of Genoa, hussars whom the pyramids had looked down upon, artillerists whom Junot's cannonball had spattered with mud, cuirassiers who had taken by assault the fleet lying at anchor in the Zuyder Zee. Some had followed Bonaparte from the bridge of Lodi. Others had accompanied Murat in the trenches of Mantua. Others had preceded Lannes in the hollow road of Montebello. The whole army of that day was present there, in the courtyard of the Tuileries, represented by a squadron or a platoon, and guarding Napoleon in repose. And that was the splendid epoch when the Grand Army had Marengo behind it and Austerlitz before it. "Sire," said the Minister of the Interior to Napoleon, "yesterday I saw the most intrepid man in your empire." "What man is that?" said the Emperor briskly. "And what has he done?" "He wants to do something, sire." "What is it?" "To visit the sewers of Paris." This man existed, and his name was Bruneseau. Chapter 4. Bruneseau. The visit took place. It was a formidable campaign, a nocturnal battle against pestilence and suffocation. It was, at the same time, a voyage of discovery. One of the survivors of this expedition, an intelligent working man, who was very young at the time, related curious details with regard to it several years ago, which Bruneseau thought himself obliged to omit in his report to the prefect of police, as unworthy of official style. The processes of disinfection were, at that epoch, extremely rudimentary. Hardly had Bruneseau crossed the first articulations of that subterranean network when 8 laborers out of the 20 refused to go any further. The operation was complicated. The visit entailed the necessity of cleaning, hence it was necessary to cleanse and at the same time to proceed, to note the entrances of water, to count the gratings and the vents, to lay out in detail the branches, to indicate the currents at the point where they parted, to define the respective bounds of the divers basins, to sound the small sewers grafted on the principal sewer, to measure the height under the keystone of each drain, and the width at the spring of the vaults as well as at the bottom, in order to determine the arrangements with regard to the level of each water entrance, either of the bottom of the arch or on the soil of the street. They advanced with toil. The lanterns pined away in the foul atmosphere. From time to time, a fainting sewerman was carried out. At certain points, there were precipices. The soil had given away. The pavement had crumbled. The sewer had changed into a bottomless well. They found nothing solid. A man disappeared suddenly. They had great difficulty getting him out again. On the advice of Fourcroy, they lighted large cages filled with tow steeped in resin, from time to time in spots which had been sufficiently disinfected. In some places, the wall was covered with misshapen fungi. One would have said tumors. The very stone seemed diseased with this unbreathable atmosphere. Bruneseau, in his exploration, proceeded downhill. At the point of separation of the two water conduits of the Grand Hurlieu, he deciphered upon a projecting stone the date of 1550. This stone indicated the limits where Philibert Delorme, charged by Henri II with visiting the subterranean drains of Paris, had halted. The stone was the mark of the 16th century on the sewer. Bruneseau found the handiwork of the 17th century once more in the ponceau drain of the Rue Vieille du Temple, vaulted between 1600 and 1650, and the handiwork of the 18th in the western section of the collecting canal, walled and vaulted in 1740. These two vaults, especially the less ancient, that of 1740, were more cracked and decrepit than the masonry of the belt sewer, which dated from 1412, an epoch when the brook of fresh water of the Ménilmontant was elevated to the dignity of the grand sewer of Paris, an advancement analogous to that of a peasant who had become the first valet de chambre to the king, something like Gros Jean transformed into La Belle. Here and there, particularly beneath the courthouse, they thought they recognized the hollows of ancient dungeons, excavated in the very sewer itself, hideous in pace. An iron neck collar was hanging in one of these cells. They walled them all up. Some of their finds were singular. Among others, the skeleton of an orangutan who had disappeared from the Jardin des Plantes in 1800, a disappearance probably connected with the famous and indisputable apparition of the devil in the Rue des Bernardins in the last year of the 18th century. The poor devil had ended by drowning himself in the sewer. Beneath this long arched drain, which terminated at the Arche Marion, a perfectly preserved rag-picker's basket excited the admiration of all connoisseurs. Everywhere, the mire, which the sewermen came to handle with intrepidity, abounded in precious objects, jewels of gold and silver, precious stones, coins. If a giant had filtered this cesspool, he would have had the riches of centuries in his lair. At the point where the two branches of the Rue du Temple and the Rue Sainte-Avoye separate, they picked up a singular Huguenot medal in copper, bearing on one side the pig hooded with a cardinal's hat, and on the other a wolf with a tiara on his head. The most surprising encounter was at the entrance to the grand sewer. This entrance had formerly been closed by a grating of which nothing but the hinges remained. From one of these hinges hung a dirty and shapeless rag, which, arrested there in its passage, no doubt, had floated there in the darkness and finished its process of being torn apart. Bruneseau held his lantern close to this rag and examined it. It was a very fine batiste, and in one of the corners, less frayed than the rest, they made out a heraldic coronet, and embroidered above these 7 letters, LAVBESP. The crown was the coronet of a marquis, and the 7 letters signified Laubespine. They recognized the fact that what they had before their eyes was a morsel of the shroud of Marat. Marat had, in his youth, had amorous intrigues. This was when he was a member of the household of the Comte d'Artois, in the capacity of physician to the stables. From these love affairs, historically proved with a great lady, he had retained this sheet as a waif or a souvenir. At his death, as this was the only linen of any fineness which he had in his house, they buried him in it. Some old woman had shrouded him for the tomb in that swaddling band in which the tragic friend of the people had enjoyed voluptuousness. Bruneseau passed on. They left that rag where it hung. They did not put the finishing touch to it. Did this arise from scorn or from respect? Marat deserved both. And then, destiny was there sufficiently stamped to make them hesitate to touch it. Besides, the things of the sepulchre must be left in the spot where they select. In short, the relic was a strange one. A marquise had slept in it. Marat had rotted in it. It had traversed the Pantheon to the end with the rats of the sewer. This chamber rag, of which Watteau would formerly have joyfully sketched every fold, had ended in becoming worthy of the fixed gaze of Dante. The whole visit to the subterranean stream of filth of Paris lasted 7 years, from 1805 to 1812. As he proceeded, Bruneseau drew, directed, and completed considerable works. In 1808, he lowered the Arch of the Ponceau, and everywhere created new lines. He pushed the sewer. In 1809, under the Rue Saint-Denis, as far as the Fountain of the Innocents. In 1810, under the Rue Foix-Manteau and under the Salpêtrière. In 1811, under the Rue Neuve de Petit Père, under the Rue de Mer, under the Rue de la Charpe, under the Place Royale. In 1812, under the Rue de la Paix and under the Chaussée d'Antin. At the same time, he had the whole network disinfected and rendered healthful. In the second year of his work, Bruneseau engaged the assistance of his son-in-law, Nargaud. It was thus that, at the beginning of the century, ancient society cleansed its double bottom and performed the toilet of its sewer. There was that much clean at all events. Tortuous, cracked, unpaved, full of fissures, intersected by gullies, jolted by eccentric elbows, mounting and descending illogically, fetid, wild, fierce, submerged obscurity, with cicatrices on its pavements and scars on its walls, terrible. Such was, retrospectively viewed, the antique sewer of Paris. Ramifications in every direction, crossings of trenches, branches, goose feet, stars, as in military mines, blind alleys, vaults lined with saltpeter, pestiferous pools, scabby sweats on the walls, drops dripping from the ceilings, darkness. Nothing could equal the horror of this old waste crypt, the digestive apparatus of Babylon. A cavern, ditch, gulf pierced with streets, a titanic mole burrow, where the mind seems to behold the enormous blind mole, the past prowling through the shadows, in the filth which has been splendor. This, we repeat, was the sewer of the past. End of Book 2, Chapter 4.
Chapters 5 and 6 of Book 2 of Les Misérables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 5 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 2, The Intestine of the Leviathan. Chapter 5, Present Progress. Today the sewer is clean, cold, straight, correct. It almost realizes the ideal of what is understood in England by the word respectable. It is proper and greyish, laid out by rule and line, one might almost say as though it came out of a bandbox. It resembles a tradesman who has become a councillor of state. One can almost see distinctly there. The mire there comports itself with decency. At first, one might readily mistake it for one of those subterranean corridors which were so common in former days, and so useful in flights of monarchs and princes in those good old times when the people loved their kings. The present sewer is a beautiful sewer. The pure style reigns there. The classical rectilinear Alexandrine, which, driven out of poetry, appears to have taken refuge in architecture, seems mingled with all the stones of that long, dark, and whitish vault. Each outlet is an arcade. The Rue de Rivoli serves as pattern even in the sewer. However, if the geometrical line is in place anywhere, it is certainly in the drainage trench of a great city. There everything should be subordinated to the shortest road. The sewer has nowadays assumed a certain official aspect. The very police reports of which it sometimes forms the subject no longer are wanting in respect towards it. The words which characterize it in administrative language are sonorous and dignified. What used to be called a gut is now called a gallery. What used to be called a hole is now called a surveying orifice. Villon would no longer meet with his ancient temporary provisional lodging. This network of cellars has its immemorial population of prowlers, rodents, swarming in greater numbers than ever. From time to time an aged and veteran rat risks his head at the window of the sewer and surveys the Parisians. But even these vermin grow tame, so satisfied are they with their subterranean palace. The cesspool no longer retains anything of its primitive ferocity. The rain, which in former days soiled the sewer, now washes it. Nevertheless, do not trust yourself too much to it. Miasmas still inhabit it. It is more hypocritical than irreproachable. The Prefecture of Police and the Commission of Health have done their best, but in spite of all the processes of disinfection, it exhales a vague, suspicious odor like Tartuffe after confession. Let us confess that, taking it all in all, this sweeping is a homage which the sewer pays to civilization, and as, from this point of view, Tartuffe's conscience is a progress over the Augean stables, it is certain that the sewers of Paris have been improved. It is more than progress, it is transmutation. Between the ancient and the present sewer there is a revolution. What has effected this revolution? The man whom all the world forgets, and whom we have mentioned, Bruneseau. Chapter 6. Future Progress. The excavation of the sewer of Paris has been no slight task. The last 10 centuries have toiled at it without being able to bring it to a termination, any more than they have been able to finish Paris. The sewer, in fact, receives all the counter-shocks of the growth of Paris. Within the bosom of the earth, it is a sort of mysterious polyp with 1,000 antennae, which expands below as the city expands above. Every time that the city cuts a street, the sewer stretches out an arm. The old monarchy had constructed only 23,300 meters of sewers. That was where Paris stood in this respect on the 1st of January, 1806. Beginning with this epoch, of which we shall shortly speak, the work was usefully and energetically resumed and prosecuted. Napoleon built, the figures are curious, 4,804 meters. Louis XVIII, 5,709. Charles X, 10,836. Louis Philippe, 89,020. The Republic of 1848, 23,381. The present government, 70,500. In all, at the present time, 226,610 meters, 60 leagues of sewers, the enormous entrails of Paris, an obscure ramification ever at work, a construction which is immense and ignored. As the reader sees, the subterranean labyrinth of Paris is today more than 10 times what it was at the beginning of the century. It is difficult to form any idea of all the perseverance and the efforts which have been required to bring this cesspool to the point of relative perfection in which it now is. It was with great difficulty that the ancient monarchical provostship and, during the last 10 years of the 18th century, the revolutionary mayoralty had succeeded in perforating the 5 leagues of sewer which existed previous to 1806. All sorts of obstacles hindered this operation, some peculiar to the soil, others inherent in the very prejudices of the laborious population of Paris. Paris is built upon a soil which is singularly rebellious to the pick, the hoe, the bore, and to human manipulation. There is nothing more difficult to pierce and to penetrate than the geological formation upon which is superposed the marvelous historical formation called Paris. As soon as work in any form whatsoever is begun and adventures upon this stretch of alluvium, subterranean resistances abound. There are liquid clays, springs, hard rocks, and those soft and deep quagmires which special science calls moutarde. The pick advances laboriously through the calcareous layers, alternating with very slender threads of clay. and schistose beds in plates encrusted with oyster shells, the contemporaries of the pre-Adamite oceans. Sometimes a rivulet suddenly bursts through a vault that has been begun and inundates the laborers, or a layer of marl is laid bare and rolls down with the fury of a cataract, breaking the stoutest supporting beams like glass. Quite recently, at Villette, when it became necessary to pass the collecting sewer under the Saint-Martin Canal without interrupting navigation or emptying the canal, a fissure appeared in the basin of the canal. Water suddenly became abundant in the subterranean tunnel, which was beyond the power of the pumping engines. It was necessary to send a diver to explore the fissure which had been made in the narrow entrance of the Grand Basin, and it was not without great difficulty that it was stopped up. Elsewhere near the Seine, and even at a considerable distance from the river, as for instance at Belleville, Grand Rue, and Lumière Passage, quicksands are encountered in which one sticks fast, and in which a man sinks visibly. Add suffocation by miasmas, burial by slides, and sudden crumbling of the earth. Add the typhus with which the workmen become slowly impregnated. In our own day, after having excavated the gallery of Clichy with a banquette to receive the principal water conduit of Ourcq, a piece of work which was executed in a trench 10 meters deep, after having, in the midst of landslides and with the aid of excavations often putrid, and of shoring up, vaulted the Bièvre from the boulevard de l'Hôpital as far as the Seine, after having, in order to deliver Paris from the floods of Montmartre, and in order to provide an outlet for that river-like pool 9 hectares in extent, which crouched near the Barrière des Martyrs, after having, let us state, constructed the line of sewers from the Barrière Blanche to the road of Aubervilliers in 4 months, working day and night, at a depth of 11 meters, after having, a thing heretofore unseen, made a subterranean sewer in the Rue Bar du Bec without a trench 6 meters below the surface, the superintendent, Monod, died. After having vaulted 3,000 meters of sewer in all quarters of the city, from the Rue Traversière Saint-Antoine to the Rue de l'Ursine, after having freed the Carrefour Sancier-Mouffetard from inundations of rain by means of the branch of the Arbalète, after having built the Saint-Georges sewer on rock and concrete in the fluid sands, after having directed the formidable lowering of the flooring of the vault timber in the Notre-Dame de Nazareth branch, Dulot, the engineer, died. There are no bulletins for such acts of bravery as these, which are more useful, nevertheless, than the brutal slaughter of the field of battle. The sewers of Paris in 1832 were far from being what they are today. Bruneseau had given the impulse, but the cholera was required to bring about the vast reconstruction which took place later on. It is surprising to say, for example, that in 1821 a part of the belt sewer, called the Grand Canal, as in Venice, still stood stagnating, uncovered to the sky, in the Rue des Gourdes. It was only in 1821 that the city of Paris found in its pocket the 260,080 francs and 6 centimes required for covering this mass of filth. The 3 absorbing wells of the Combat, the Cunette, and Saint-Mande, with their discharging mouths, their apparatus, their cesspools, and their depuratory branches, only date from 1836. The intestinal sewer of Paris has been made over anew, and, as we have said, it has been extended more than tenfold within the last quarter of a century. 30 years ago, at the epoch of the insurrection of the 5th and 6th of June, it was still, in many localities, nearly the same ancient sewer. A very great number of streets which are now convex were then sunken causeways. At the end of a slope, where the tributaries of a street or crossroads ended, there were often to be seen large square gratings with heavy bars, whose iron, polished by the footsteps of the throng, gleamed dangerous and slippery for vehicles and caused horses to fall. The official language of the roads and bridges gave to these gratings the expressive name of cassis. In 1832, in a number of streets, in the Rue de l'Étoile, the Rue Saint-Louis, the Rue du Temple, the Rue Vieille du Temple, the Rue Notre-Dame de Nazareth, the Rue Folie-Méricourt, the Quai aux Fleurs, the Rue de Petit-Meuse, the Rue de Normandie, the Rue Pont-aux-Biches, the Rue de Marais, the Faubourg Saint-Martin, the Rue Notre-Dame des Victoires, the Faubourg Montmartre, the Rue Grange Batelière, in the Champs-Élysées, the Rue Jacob, the Rue de Tournon. The ancient Gothic sewer still cynically displayed its maw. It consisted of enormous voids of stone catch basins, sometimes surrounded by stone posts, with monumental effrontery. Paris in 1806 still had nearly the same sewers numerically as stated in 1663, 5,300 fathoms. After Bruneseau, on the 1st of January 1832, it had 40,300 meters. Between 1806 and 1831, there had been built, on an average, 750 meters annually. Afterwards, 8 and even 10,000 meters of galleries were constructed every year, in masonry of small stones, with hydraulic mortar which hardens under water on a cement foundation. At 200 francs the meter, the 60 leagues of Paris sewers of the present day represent 48 millions. In addition to the economic progress which we have indicated at the beginning, grave problems of public hygiene are connected with that immense question, the sewers of Paris. Paris is the center of two sheets, a sheet of water and a sheet of air. The sheet of water, lying at a tolerably great depth underground, but already sounded by 2 bores, is furnished by the layer of green clay situated between the chalk and the Jurassic limestone. This layer may be represented by a disk 25 leagues in circumference. A multitude of rivers and brooks ooze there. One drinks the Seine, the Marne, the Yonne, the Oise, the Aisne, the Cher, the Vienne, and the Loire in a glass of water from the well of Grenelle. The sheet of water is healthy. It comes from heaven in the first place, and next from the earth. The sheet of air is unhealthy. It comes from the sewer. All the miasms of the cesspool are mingled with the breath of the city, hence this bad breath. The air taken from above a dung heap, as has been scientifically proved, is purer than the air taken from above Paris. In a given time, with the aid of progress, mechanisms become perfected, and as light increases, the sheet of water will be employed to purify the sheet of air, that is to say, to wash the sewer. The reader knows that by washing the sewer, we mean the restitution of the filth to the earth, the return to the soil of dung and of manure to the fields. Through this simple act, the entire social community will experience a diminution of misery and an augmentation of health. At the present hour, the radiation of diseases from Paris extends to 50 leagues around the Louvre, taken as the hub of this pestilential wheel. We might say that, for 10 centuries, the cesspool has been the disease of Paris. The sewer is the blemish which Paris has in her blood. The popular instinct has never been deceived in it. The occupation of sewermen was formerly almost as perilous and almost as repugnant to the people as the occupation of knacker, which was so long held in horror and handed over to the executioner. High wages were necessary to induce a mason to disappear in that fetid mine. The ladder of the cesspool cleaner hesitated to plunge into it. It was said in proverbial form, to descend into the sewer is to enter the grave. And all sorts of hideous legends, as we have said, covered this colossal sink with terror. a dread sinkhole which bears the traces of the revolutions of the globe as of the revolutions of man, and where are to be found vestiges of all cataclysms, from the shells of the deluge to the rag of Marat. End of Book 2, Chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 1 of Book 3 of Les Misérables, Volume 5, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 5, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 3, Mud but the Soul. Chapter 1, The Sewer and Its Surprises. It was in the sewers of Paris that Jean Valjean found himself. Still another resemblance between Paris and the sea. As in the ocean, the diver may disappear there. The transition was an unheard of one. In the very heart of the city, Jean Valjean had escaped from the city, and in the twinkling of an eye, in the time required to lift the cover and to replace it, he had passed from broad daylight to complete obscurity, from midday to midnight, from tumult to silence, from the whirlwind of thunders to the stagnation of the tomb, and by a vicissitude far more tremendous even than that of the Rue Polonceau, from the most extreme peril to the most absolute obscurity. An abrupt fall into a cavern, a disappearance into the secret trap door of Paris, to quit that street where death was on every side, for that sort of sepulchre where there was life, was a strange instant. He remained for several seconds as though bewildered, listening, stupefied. The waste trap of safety had suddenly yawned beneath him. Celestial goodness had, in a manner, captured him by treachery, adorable ambuscades of Providence. Only the wounded man did not stir, and Jean Valjean did not know whether that which he was carrying in that grave was a living being or a dead corpse. His first sensation was one of blindness. All of a sudden he could see nothing. It seemed to him, too, that in one instant he had become deaf. He no longer heard anything. The frantic storm of murder which had been let loose a few feet above his head did not reach him, thanks to the thickness of the earth which separated him from it, as we have said, otherwise than faintly and indistinctly, and like a rumbling in the depths. He felt that the ground was solid under his feet. That was all, but that was enough. He extended one arm and then the other, touched the walls on both sides, and perceived that the passage was narrow. He slipped, and thus perceived that the pavement was wet. He cautiously put forward one foot, fearing a hole, a sink, some gulf. He discovered that the paving continued. A gust of fetidness informed him of the place in which he stood. After the lapse of a few minutes he was no longer blind. A little light fell through the manhole through which he had descended, and his eyes became accustomed to this cavern. He began to distinguish something. The passage in which he had burrowed, no other word can better express the situation, was walled in behind him. It was one of those blind alleys which the special jargon terms branches. In front of him there was another wall, a wall like night. The light of the air-hole died out 10 or 12 paces from the point where Jean Valjean stood, and barely cast a wan pallor on a few meters of the damp walls of the sewer. Beyond, the opaqueness was massive. To penetrate thither seemed horrible. An entrance into it appeared like an engulfment. A man could, however, plunge into that wall of fog, and it was necessary so to do. Haste was even requisite. It occurred to Jean Valjean that the grating which he had caught sight of under the flagstones might also catch the eye of the soldiery, and that everything hung upon this chance. They also might descend into that well and search it. There was not a minute to be lost. He had deposited Marius on the ground. He picked him up again. That is the real word for it. Placed him on his shoulders once more, and set out. He plunged resolutely into the gloom. The truth is that they were less safe than Jean Valjean fancied. Perils of another sort and no less serious were awaiting them, perchance. After the lightning-charged whirlwind of the combat, the cavern of miasmas and traps. After chaos, the sewer. Jean Valjean had fallen from one circle of hell into another. When he had advanced 50 paces, he was obliged to halt. A problem presented itself. The passage terminated in another gut which he encountered across his path. There 2 ways presented themselves. Which should he take? Ought he to turn to the left or to the right? How was he to find his bearings in that black labyrinth? This labyrinth, to which we have already called the reader's attention, has a clue, which is its slope. To follow to the slope is to arrive at the river. This Jean Valjean instantly comprehended. He said to himself that he was probably in the sewer des Halles, that if he were to choose the path to the left and follow the slope, he would arrive in less than a quarter of an hour at some mouth on the Seine between the Pont au Change and the Pont Neuf. That is to say, he would make his appearance in broad daylight on the most densely peopled spot in Paris. Perhaps he would come out on some manhole at the intersection of streets. Amazement of the passers-by at beholding 2 bleeding men emerge from the earth at their feet. Arrival of the police, a call to arms of the neighboring post of guards. Thus they would be seized before they had even got out. It would be better to plunge into that labyrinth, to confide themselves to that black gloom, and to trust to Providence for the outcome. He ascended the incline and turned to the right. When he had turned the angle of the gallery, the distant glimmer of an air-hole disappeared. The curtain of obscurity fell upon him once more, and he became blind again. Nevertheless, he advanced as rapidly as possible. Marius's 2 arms were passed round his neck, and the former's feet dragged behind him. He held both these arms with one hand, and groped along the wall with the other. Marius's cheek touched his, and clung there, bleeding. He felt a warm stream which came from Marius, trickling down upon him, and making its way under his clothes. But a humid warmth near his ear, which the mouth of the wounded man touched, indicated respiration, and consequently life. The passage along which Jean Valjean was now proceeding was not so narrow as the first. Jean Valjean walked through it with considerable difficulty. The rain of the preceding day had not as yet entirely run off, and it created a little torrent in the centre of the bottom, and he was forced to hug the wall in order not to have his feet in the water. Thus he proceeded in the gloom. He resembled the beings of the night groping in the invisible, and lost beneath the earth in veins of shadow. Still, little by little, whether it was that the distant air-holes emitted a little wavering light in this opaque gloom, or whether his eyes had become accustomed to the obscurity, some vague vision returned to him, and he began once more to gain a confused idea, now of the wall which he touched, now of the vault beneath which he was passing. The pupil dilates in the dark, and the soul dilates in misfortune, and ends by finding God there. It was not easy to direct his course. The line of the sewer re-echoes, so to speak, the line of the streets which lie above it. There were then in Paris 2,200 streets. Let the reader imagine himself beneath that forest of gloomy branches which is called the sewer. The system of sewers existing at that epoch, placed end to end, would have given a length of 11 leagues. We have said above that the actual network, thanks to the special activity of the last 30 years, was no less than 60 leagues in extent. Jean Valjean began by committing a blunder. He thought that he was beneath the Rue Saint-Denis, and it was a pity that it was not so. Under the Rue Saint-Denis there is an old stone sewer which dates from Louis XIII. and which runs straight to the collecting sewer, called the Grand Sewer, with but a single elbow on the right on the elevation of the ancient Cour des Miracles, and a single branch, the Saint-Martin sewer, whose 4 arms describe a cross. But the gut of the Petite Truanderie, the entrance to which was in the vicinity of the Corinthe wine shop, has never communicated with the sewer of the Rue Saint-Denis. It ended at the Montmartre sewer, and it was in this that Jean Valjean was entangled. There, opportunities of losing oneself abound. The Montmartre sewer is one of the most labyrinthine of the ancient network. Fortunately, Jean Valjean had left behind him the sewer of the markets, whose geometrical plan presents the appearance of a multitude of parrots' roosts piled on top of each other. But he had before him more than one embarrassing encounter and more than one street corner, for they are streets, presenting itself in the gloom like an interrogation point. First, on his left, the vast sewer of the Plâtrière, a sort of Chinese puzzle, thrusting out and entangling its chaos of T's and Z's under the post office and under the rotunda of the wheat market, as far as the Seine, where it terminates in a Y. Secondly, on his right, the curving corridor of the Rue de Cadran, with its 3 teeth, which are also blind courts. Thirdly, on his left, the branch of the Mail, complicated almost at its inception with a sort of fork, and proceeding from zigzag to zigzag until it ends in the grand crypt of the outlet of the Louvre, truncated and ramified in every direction. And, lastly, the blind alley of a passage of the Rue de Janeire, without counting little ducts here and there, before reaching the belt sewer, which alone could conduct him to some issue sufficiently distant to be safe. Had Jean Valjean had any idea of all that we have here pointed out, he would speedily have perceived, merely by feeling the wall, that he was not in the subterranean gallery of the Rue Saint-Denis. Instead of the ancient stone, instead of the antique architecture, haughty and royal even in the sewer, with pavement and string courses of granite and mortar costing 800 livres the fathom, he would have felt under his hand contemporary cheapness, economical expedience, porous stone filled with mortar on a concrete foundation, which costs 200 francs the metre, and the bourgeois masonry known as petits matériaux, small stuff. But of all this he knew nothing. He advanced with anxiety, but with calmness, seeing nothing, knowing nothing, buried in chance, that is to say, engulfed in providence. By degrees, we will admit, a certain horror seized upon him. The gloom which enveloped him penetrated his spirit. He walked in an enigma. This aqueduct of the sewer is formidable. It interlaces in a dizzy fashion. It is a melancholy thing to be caught in this Paris of shadows. Jean Valjean was obliged to find and even to invent his route without seeing it. In this unknown, every step that he risked might be his last. How was he to get out? Should he find an issue? Should he find it in time? Would that colossal subterranean sponge with its stone cavities allow itself to be penetrated and pierced? Should he there encounter some unexpected knot in the darkness? Should he arrive at the inextricable and the impassable? Would Marius die there of hemorrhage, and he of hunger? Should they end by both getting lost and by furnishing 2 skeletons in a nook of that night? He did not know. He put all these questions to himself without replying to them. The intestines of Paris form a precipice. Like the prophet, he was in the belly of the monster. All at once he had a surprise. At the most unforeseen moment, and without having ceased to walk in a straight line, he perceived that he was no longer ascending. The water of the rivulet was beating against his heels instead of meeting him at his toes. The sewer was now descending. Why? Was he about to arrive suddenly at the Seine? This danger was a great one, but the peril of retreating was still greater. He continued to advance. It was not towards the Seine that he was proceeding. The ridge which the soil of Paris forms on its right bank empties one of its watersheds into the Seine, and the other into the Grand Sewer. The crest of this ridge, which determines the division of the waters, describes a very capricious line. The culminating point, which is the point of separation of the currents, is in the Sainte-Avoie sewer, beyond the Rue Michel Comte, in the sewer of the Louvre, near the boulevards, and in the Montmartre sewer, near the Halles. It was this culminating point that Jean Valjean had reached. He was directing his course towards the Belt sewer. He was on the right path, but he did not know it. Every time that he encountered a branch, he felt of its angles, and if he found that the opening which presented itself was smaller than the passage in which he was, he did not enter, but continued his route, rightly judging that every narrower way must needs terminate in a blind alley, and could only lead him further from his goal, that is to say, the outlet. Thus he avoided the quadruple trap which was set for him in the darkness by the 4 labyrinths which we have just enumerated. At a certain moment he perceived that he was emerging from beneath the Paris which was petrified by the uprising, where the barricades had suppressed circulation, and that he was entering beneath the living and normal Paris. Overhead he suddenly heard a noise as of thunder, distant but continuous. It was the rumbling of vehicles. He had been walking for about half an hour, at least according to the calculation which he made in his own mind, and he had not yet thought of rest. He had merely changed the hand with which he was holding Marius. The darkness was more profound than ever, but its very depth reassured him. All at once he saw his shadow in front of him. It was outlined on a faint, almost indistinct reddish glow, which vaguely empurpled the flooring vault underfoot and the vault overhead, and gilded to his right and to his left the 2 viscous walls of the passage. Stupefied, he turned round. Behind him, in the portion of the passage which he had just passed through, at a distance which appeared to him immense, piercing the dense obscurity, flamed a sort of horrible star, which had the air of surveying him. It was the gloomy star of the police which was rising in the sewer. In the rear of that star, 8 or 10 forms were moving about in a confused way, black, upright, indistinct, horrible. End of Book 3, Chapter 1.